Before we dive into creating our forum components, pages, routes, and whatnot, we should decide how our data will look like and what the source will be. A common forum consists of threads, posts, and users. The Vue.js forum, for example, has also some channels here on the left. Inside the channels, we can find the threads. Think of the thread as a stream of posts, where the first post is the content of the thread, while the rest are the thread's replies. To get started with developing our own forum, we can go with a JSON file that will contain all the data. Later in this course, we will use the Google Cloud Firestore as our dynamic data source, but for now, we will be fine with static data. Let's see how we would like a thread object to be. Firstly, it needs a unique ID or key so we are able to distinguish it and find it. It definitely needs a title and a created at or a published at property that will include the timestamp of when the thread was created. Each thread should also include its posts. This property will be an array. Lastly, it should include the ID of the user who started the thread. We can name this property user ID. I will leave this empty for now. This is enough to get us started. So, I will create a JSON object that will be our central store, and I will add a threads property. The threads property can be an array or an object. I prefer to have it as an array where each element can be found by its unique ID. You might think that the posts can live in the threads post property, but it's better not to have them nested here so it's easier to access them later. Thus, I will add the posts property to our root object. That again will be an array. I will mock a post object here that will have an ID of p1. Each post should have an ID, a published at property, and a user ID, similar to the threads. Additionally, it should have a text property that will include the content of the post. The post also needs a thread ID property that will tell which thread owns this post. Here I will use the ID of the thread we have, which is t1. Okay, we can go on and create the users. I will add the users property that will contain our first user. Users can have dozens of details like email, name, Twitter handle, website, and many more. For now, I will just add a name and an ID. Assuming that this user created the post and the thread we have, I will use its ID for the threads and posts user ID property. If you are used to MongoDB or another non-relational database, you might be used in having the posts and the threads nested into the user objects. On the other hand, if you use SQL or another relational database, you might be used in having the foreign key only in the related resources. In the Google Cloud Firestore, which we will use as our final database, we have a lot of options. We found that the simplest yet performant solution is to only have the user ID within the related resources. We can easily get the count of posts for a user by simply filtering through posts and finding the ones that have the same user ID. Let me show you. Here, for example, to find all the posts of our user, we would do data, posts, filter, and then we will filter the posts that have user ID equal to U1. Later on, we will perform a query in our database. There are of course a lot of options on how to design your database, and you are free to choose any structure that suits you best. But we highly recommend following the approach we do here for the course, so it is easy for you to follow along. If you feel adventurous, you are welcome to try another structure and let us know how that worked for you. With the basic resources in place, we can create forums and categories. A forum is a group of threads, and a category is a group of forums. For instance, a category discussions can include forums like pets, fishing, and cooking. Each of these forums will include threads related to this topic. With this in mind, we can add the forums to our data object. We need an ID, a name, a description, a category ID to connect them with the categories next, and a threads property that will include the keys of the threads. Next, the categories. They can be simpler and have only an ID, a name, and the forums property. Now, all our objects are connected with each other using foreign keys. I notice I missed the brackets for the post object, so I will fix it now. Let me show you quickly how we will be able to access one of our resources and its relationships in our code. I will copy-paste my data object in the browser console to play around. To find the thread using an ID, we will do data.threads.find, and then we will look for the thread whose ID is equal to T1 in this case. This way, we can access the thread object we are looking for. Now, if we want to find the posts that belong to this thread, we have to filter the posts based on the thread ID property. Notice that we should do filter and not find, because find will only return the first result that meets our criteria, while filter will return all of the results. Thus, the returned post is inside an array. So this is how we will utilize our data store. In order to start building our application and have enough examples to work with, we have prepared some dummy data in this format that you can download from GitHub. You can create your own if you want to, but you will have to add new properties constantly as our application grows. The data we have prepared include more information than the ones we saw in this lesson, but the logic is the same. We will review them in the course when we will need to use them. Feel free to ignore them until now. Before I close this lesson, I will go in our project and I will create a file under the src directory that I will call data.json. I will place the seed data in here. Make sure to download this file and place it in your src directory before the next lesson. The first thing to do before being able to render any data on a page is to have access to some data. When you start building an application, it is usually handy to work with a local file or mocked data before hitting a remote API or another source. In this lesson, we will learn how to import and use data from JSON files. To start using the data we have in our data.json file, we can import it in one of our components. Let's open the Hello World component and go to the top of the script section. Here I will use the import ES6 statement. The import statement syntax is import name from path to file. This is the name of the local variable that will contain the imported code. You can import a JavaScript class, a single function, a variable, or an object, and so on. In our case, I will name the local variable source data, and the file path is src/data.json. Since the file lives outside of the components directory, we can use the relative path, which would be @data, or use the special @ symbol that represents the src directory. Using the @ symbol instead of relative paths is recommended as it unifies imports in all components. Using the shorthand also makes it easy to refactor in the future if you decide to organize your components in a different way. So my import statement will be import source data from @/data.json. To ensure that we have actually imported the data, we can log them in the console right after the import statement. Now, when the page is reloaded, let's open the console and take a look. As we expect, source data has a key for threads, posts, users, and so on. Now, let's display some of our data in our HTML. Vue templates naturally support JSON data, so you can just type it in your template. To be able to display data in a components template like this, we need to declare this data in our components data option. The data option is a function that returns an object like this. Here I will call our local data source data, the same that I reference in the template. If we check back in the browser, we can see our data object being displayed in full here. That's great. If we wanted to display just the threads object, we could either do that in the template or just map the threads in our data. To map just the threads, here we would do threads:/source_data.threads. And this way, we can display the full threads object in the browser. In this lesson, we will create the first page of our forum, the home page. We will also learn how to loop through lists and render list items on the page. Let's start with creating a new component that will represent our home page. I will call my component page home. In my editor, WebStorm, there is this option to create a Vue component. This will add the .vue file extension, and it will also create the skeleton of template, script, and style. If you are using VS Code, you can create a Vue component file, and you can also have this boilerplate using Vector. The template, script, and style blocks form the SFC. SFC stands for Single File Component. Single File Components are special Vue files that allow us to have both template, JavaScript, and CSS in one file. One of the best practices in Vue applications is to give your components good names. But what makes a component name good? This answer, along with many other best practices we will refer to during this course, are listed in the Vue Style Guide. The Vue Style Guide is a set of recommendations battle-tested by the Vue core team and thousands of developers in their Vue projects over the last years. There are 4 groups of suggestions. Priority A rules, essentials, are a must-have. These rules help you prevent bugs in your applications. Take some time to read them and know their existence. Even if you don't learn them all now, you can come back later when you need them and learn one in detail. The strongly recommended and recommended rules are almost always a good idea. Lastly, priority D, use with caution, are rules that their applicability depends on the use case. The first priority A rule is about naming components. Component names should always be multi-word, except for root app components and built-in components provided by Vue, such as transition or component. This prevents conflicts with existing and future HTML elements, since all HTML elements are a single word. Since we are developing a home page, I use the words home and page. In addition to that, I use the page as a prefix to provide a self-explanatory grouping for all future components that will represent separate pages. For example, page home, page login, page search, etc. For a component file to be used and rendered, we need to connect it to a parent component. We have the app view as our root component. So to display the newly created page home component in our app, we need to import it there. To do that, we will first switch to app view and use the import statement to import it. Now, we need to register the page home component in the special property called components. By doing this, we let the Vue compiler know about custom tags that will be present in our template markup. The key is the name of the element we want to use to render the component in the markup. For us, that will be page home. And the value is the actual component itself. Since both the key and the value are the same, we can use the ES6 object property shorthand. And the last thing we need to do is to add our component to the template. When we add a custom element to the template, it's recommended to use kebab case. So, our element will be page-home. You can also use Pascal case. But since HTML is case insensitive, many people prefer kebab case. Let's check the browser to see if it's imported correctly. Here we have an error. Failed to compile. The template requires child element. So we get an error because our page home component doesn't have a template. So let's add one. Hello from page home. If we check back in the browser, our component is now rendered properly in the bottom of the page. Great. I will remove all the references to the Hello World component from app view to clean up our page. Great. Now we can go back to page home and implement the data in the markup. Our goal for the home page for now is to display the threads and the posts in a form of a conversation. Let's import our data JSON in our component. Next, I will add the data function to the component. Remember that the data function is needed to define the initial data that the component will have. In Vue 3, the data property must be a function that returns an object. In Vue 2, it was also possible for data to be an object, which was a bad practice. So in Vue 3, data must always be a function. In the return statement of the data function, I will create a threads property and set it to data.threads. Next, let's go to the template to add our threads. This time, we want to create one element for each thread and not display all the threads in one object as we did in app view. I will create a div and use v-for to loop through the threads. The v-for directive is used to render lists of items represented as an array or an object. The v-for directive requires a special syntax in the form of v-for item in items, where items is the source data array and item is an alias for the current element. In our case, the array is called threads. The local element can be called anything we like, even just item, but I will call it thread as that's what this item really is. Inside each div, I will add an h2 element to print out the thread title inside. Let's switch to the browser to see the output. Here we get an error because elements in iteration expect to have vbind key directives. Do you know what this means? It means that Vue is complaining because we didn't specify a key for each div. Whenever you render a list of elements, you should pass the key attribute in order to help Vue keep track of the list. The key should be unique for each element. Here we have access to the thread ID that is unique for each thread, so I will use that. If we check back in the browser, you can see that it works now. And here we can see all the titles of the threads we have in our data JSON. In a real-world forum, you may expect more sophisticated information on the page, such as what posts are in the thread and who wrote them. So, let's add this to the homepage template for now. First, I will enhance our component data section with posts and users. A thread usually has multiple posts within it. So let's add another div inside the thread element and use v-for again to loop through the posts this time. Here it will be post ID in thread.posts. That's because we have the IDs inside the thread object and not the whole post. Let's also add the key equal to post ID. Inside here, we have access to the post ID, which we can use to find the actual post. Let's create a paragraph tag to print out the post text. To do so, we will need to search in our posts array for the post with a corresponding ID. We can do this at first using the arrayFind method directly in the template. The find method returns the value of the first element in the provided array that satisfies the provided testing function. If no value satisfies the testing function, undefined is returned. To display the content of the post, we will use its text property. We can chain it directly to the find method call. Let's see if that works. It does. So notice now how we have the thread title, and within each thread we have the 3 or 4 related posts here. Okay, let's go back to the editor and also display the author's name. We can get the name from the user's data, and we have the user ID on the post object. We can do this very long find here to get the user, and once we get to that, we can display the username. And now, inside the thread, before its post, you can see the user that wrote it. This code looks way too complex, right? As we can't persist calculated data in the template's logic, we have to have those repeated and inefficient arrayFind function calls. Is there a more efficient way to work with data structure in Vue? Yes, of course there is. We can do it in several ways actually, but for now, let's approach that by introducing methods that will contain this search logic and can be reused across the component code. Methods is a special property on the component instance. You can access these methods directly on the Vue instance or use them in directive expressions. All methods will have their this context automatically bound to the Vue instance. Let's create 2 methods that will do the search for post and for user and return the found item. This function will find the post using its ID, so it needs to get the post ID as the argument. We can directly access component data using this. So we can do this.posts.find and find the post that has the specified ID. Great, I will do the same for the user. Now we can improve our template to have function calls instead of the search logic directly. Here we still need to access the post ID. Now let's check how the page looks. Nothing changed in the UI, but we have improved our code organization in the component. We now reuse the logic code in the methods, and we have made the template code easier to read. When you are developing a web application, it's common to have a template coming from a designer or to use a theme from an online marketplace. Most likely, these templates will come with a styles file and a mockup, usually some static HTML files. The styles file could be Sass, Less, CSS, or even something else. For the forum application, we have prepared the mockups along with the CSS file. Make sure to download these files. You will find the link in the description of this lesson. The first thing we have to do is to import the CSS in our application. So I will copy the CSS file and I will put it under public/style CSS. There are various ways to add styling to a Vue application. We will start with including a link for the CSS file inside our root index.html file. This will import the whole list of styles from the file. To structure our HTML properly, I will open up the thread.html file on the browser and inspect the elements. The container div has a class of container. So, within our root component template, app_vue, I will create a div with a class of container and I will wrap the rest of the markup. The next thing to do is to structure the contents of the page home component according to the design. To help myself, I will copy the HTML code from the browser and I will update these static values with our dynamic values. Let's see what we got here. On top we have the breadcrumbs. I will delete this for now. Next we have this h1, which is a thread title. This div contains all the thread information, so we would want to create one of these for each of the threads we display in the home page. Thus, I will copy our v4 here. Great. This is the title of the thread, so I will replace it with our dynamic value. Here we have some information regarding the author of the thread that we will look into later. For now, I will remove them. Here we have the post list, which is a list of all the replies of the thread. So here we will want to create one div with a class of post for each thread post. To do that, I will copy the v4 we created in our initial template. I will place it here for a bit so I can easily copy-paste the dynamic values. So here we want to create one div with a class of post for each post in the thread posts array. Awesome. Here we have the user info, where we want to display the name of the user that wrote the post. We have that here, so I will copy-paste it inside the static value. Because we don't have links for the profile page yet, I will replace this with a hash. I will do that for every link that we don't have the route yet. This is the image that is the avatar of the user that wrote the post. We haven't used this value yet, but we can easily implement it now. To make a dynamic binding for an attribute in our HTML, we use the colon symbol, which is the shorthand for vbind. Here, instead of the static URL, we want to display the avatar URL of the user. We have this value in the avatar property of each user. So here we have this code that will bring us the user object that created the post, and then we can access the value that we are looking for, in this case, the avatar. Next up, we have some stats related to the user. For now, we'll remove the last two, and I will keep the posts in case we want to implement it soon. And here we have the post content. This is the actual text that the user wrote and wanted to send as a reply or as a thread. We have this value here where we get the text property of the post. Then we have a button here that allows the user to edit the thread that I will remove for now. We don't have the formatted date yet, but we can have the published at property of our post for now. The reactions are a lot of fun, but I will also remove for now since we are still just getting started. Great, then we have other posts, but we don't want to hardcode this because we will create a new div with a class of post for every post in our posts array here. I will remove our previous code from the bottom of the template and let's see what we get in the browser. Awesome! We have this Vue logo on top that comes from our app Vue component, and we now have this nice presentation of our threads and posts that we get from our theme. This looks much better, right? If it doesn't work for you right after you have included the style sheet, you might need to give it a refresh since you have changed the index.html file. It is recommended to have as little global CSS as possible. This way, you only load the styles you really need, which means that your application becomes lighter and performs better. To get an idea how this would work in our application, we would have to define all the classes related to the thread and posts, like post item and post list, within our page home component. This way, our users will not load this CSS when they visit another page that doesn't need them, like for example the login page. To show you, I will cut all these rules related to the thread from the style CSS file. Then I will add a style tag in our page home component. And now I will put them in the style tag of our page home component. Now, if I switch back to the browser, you see that the output is the same, but these styles have been processed and extracted by a Vue loader into a style tag inside the HTML head. Since we do not have the components in place at the moment, I will keep the CSS global temporarily. When our application is in shape, we can split the styles appropriately. It is also recommended to have the global styles in the root component's style tag instead of importing them in the HTML head tag as we have it now in our index.html file. Thus, we should move the style sheet from the static directory to src so it is processed by Webpack. This way, it will also be minified when we build our application for production. To achieve this, I will import the styles in app Vue in the style tag, and then I will remove the link tag from index.html. If we check in the browser now, we don't see a difference, but now the style sheet is part of our source code. Let me show you one immediate benefit we got by doing that. Right now, the CSS file is 47 kilobytes. I will build our application for production using the command npm run build. Once it is done, you can see now that the app CSS is roughly 36 kilobytes, while the initial style CSS file was 47. So the Vue CLI CSS loaders made the style sheet about 25% lighter by compressing it and removing any duplicate rules we might have. Before we move to the next lesson, you might wonder what styles you should have globally available. And that is of course up to you and your team. But the typical global styles would be styles related to standard HTML elements that will be used in many places of your application. For example, global styles would be related to text sizes, links, buttons, lists, images, and so on. And if your website is based on a CSS framework like Material Design or Bootstrap, you could make their essential classes available globally by importing them within your root component. If you want to import a style sheet from a node module, you can target it using the tilde prefix that is provided by CSS Loader. So, to import Bootstrap CSS, for example, you could write import, then tilde bootstrap CSS/bootstrap CSS. You can do the same with Sass or less files. The Vue CLI loader supports all popular CSS preprocessors out of the box.